the thing that we want students reflecting on or intentionally pausing on, it usually helps them to plan, to get ready for their will experience. So, things like, what do I want to accomplish? What are the skills that I'm hoping to learn or do or apply on this will experience? What will experience might align nicely to my values and needs, or the impact I want to make in the world. So that reflection in that before experience, that intentional pause, can really be about figuring out what it is that I'm hoping I'm going to do or apply.
Welcome to Work, Learn, Repeat, the cooperative and experiential education podcast from the University of Waterloo, where we explore work-integrated learning and how we can help prepare students, educators, and employers for the future of work. I'm your host, Jody Szymanski, and today I'm having a conversation with the director of the Center for Work-Integrated Learning, Dr. Andrea Prier. We'll explore the practice of reflection, the tools you can use to reflect, and how it can help students to find their passions, plan their careers, and hone the skills for the future. Tell us who you are and what unit you work in.
So my name's Andrea Prier, and I'm the director for the Center for Work-Integrated Learning.
And what does the Center for Work-Integrated Learning do?
So the Center for Work-Integrated Learning is about the pedagogy and practice of work-integrated learning. And what that means is basically we build the curriculum that sits behind all the experiences that students do. And then in practice, we also do other forms of work-integrated learning. So lots of people know of co-op, but there's lots of other different forms. And so my unit actually provides those experiences for students as well.
Okay. So I know that in the professional development programs, you talk a lot about reflection. What is reflection?
So reflection, simply put for me, it's about intentional pauses. If you think about it from a definitional perspective, it's about learning from your experience.
Okay.
But the key is that the experience itself is not where the learning happens. You have to take the experience and then pause and reflect on the experience and then connect what you just did to maybe what you knew before. So tangibly, it's kind of a fluffy word, but people do it all the time.
Right.
And, if you really think about it, if you just completed a really hard project and you paused and you thought, what went well? Oh, I collaborated really, really well on that project. What didn't go so well? Oh, my communication with some of my colleagues on that project wasn't great. And then what were you surprised by? Well, I thought I had good communication, but I guess I didn't. That's reflection.
Okay.
So it's not it doesn't have to be theoretical.
Right.
It doesn't have to be, it's literally intentionally pausing and thinking about stuff.
And why is that so important for quality work-integrated learning?
So reflection, I think, is an integral part of quality work-integrated learning because it is that intentional opportunity for you to make connections between what you learned in your classroom, so the theory of something, and then how you applied it on your experience, which is the practice. And that reflection is kind of the bridge between it, right?
Okay.
It's the intentional, how does this connect to this? And how did I do it applying it?
Right. And so when we think about reflection, we're thinking about looking back at what just happened. Within the context of cooperative and experiential education, how does that looking back help students move forward?
So it's really interesting because people always think about reflection as looking back, and it totally is, right? But if it's really intentionally designed in a work-integrated learning space, it can also be about looking forward. And so I like to think about reflection as the glue that binds the phases of the work-integrated learning opportunity together. So when you think about work-integrated learning, you can break it into three phases. You've got the before experience phase, then you've got the during experience phase, which is the actual work that you're doing, and then the after experience phase. And you can reflect in all three phases.
Okay.
And if you do that before and during and after, that's that kind of glue that binds it all together and makes it a really robust and quality will experience.
Okay. So in that practice of reflection, and especially broken up into those 3 stages, are there different questions students should ask themselves at each one of those stages? And what might some of those questions be?
So I think there's two ways we can think about this. There's tangible questions that they can ask, and there's also like depending on the stage,
Right.
because they kind of like flip back
Okay.
and forth together. So if I started to think first in the before experience, the thing that we want students reflecting on or intentionally pausing on, it usually helps them to plan
Okay.
to get ready for their well experience. So things like, what do I want to accomplish?
Mhm.
What are the skills that I'm hoping to learn or do or apply on this will experience? What will experience might align nicely to my values and needs or
Right.
the impact I want to make in the world? So that reflection in that before experience, that intentional pause can really be about like figuring out what it is that I'm hoping I'm going to do or apply.
Okay.
Um, and that's before.
Right.
In the enduring experience phase, if you think about reflection, it's a little bit different, but it's kind of like helping students to engage actively.
Okay.
You can go through a day of work and just go through the tasks and check the lists and follow along. But if you're reflecting along the way, it helps you to think more deeply about what you're actually learning or doing.
Okay.
So it's about prompting learners to be mindful or attentive, and you're asking questions like, so what? So in this phase, you might be like, okay, before my experience, I wanted to learn about how to communicate information, technical information,
Right.
to a general audience.
Hmm.
That's my goal going into the experience. And that's what I was thinking about in my before phase. Um, and so then during my experience, I'm saying, so what? How am I doing at that? Am I able to communicate this information, my technical knowledge around my discipline, to a generalist audience? And what am I doing to make it work? So, for example, maybe I'm using a whiteboard in a meeting, and that would be like a moment of reflection, right?
Right.
You're like, what's that tangible thing that I'm doing? Or I'm sending out a visual in advance to help people to understand. And that's that so what piece,
Hmm.
kind of connecting and actively engaging to the experience. And then after the experience, your questions would be around like, now what? And it provides a structure for you to think about that now what
Right.
after the experience. So things like this last will experience I had the opportunity to take that technical information and apply it in a general. Did I like it? How did it go? Did my skills improve? What courses might I want to take to continue to improve that in the future? And that's the really cool part about will,
Hmm.
is that like if you tie those reflections together, you can see how I thought about the communication skills I wanted to learn, applied them, thought about practical tools to help me apply them, and then think next about how I wanted to grow.
And I could see that really helping students prepare for their next will experience because they could take those reflections and really go back to their resume and review some things in their cover letter and
Yeah.
add those kind of things. And it makes it a lot less stressful to go back and do that. What are
Mhm.
some of the other benefits of doing that?
It's funny because you're hitting on it really, really well. I think that the first thing that I would say is, in general, if you did that kind of like three stage throughout that we were trying to teach, it helps students to articulate their skills in a completely different way,
Hmm.
right? So both for a cover letter or an interview or a conversation with a colleague, but you could, without that kind of reflective stage, you'd be like, I made Excel spreadsheets.
Right.
That was my job. But if you've gone through kind of this, what, so what, now what process, or you'd say, like, I created Excel spreadsheets, right? And they had an impact on the company in this way. And here's what I want to do next, right? The story changes
Right.
and it sets students up in a different way
Yeah.
to have a conversation.
And I can imagine for some students, it shows them what they might not want to do and kind of change direction,
Yeah,
either in their schooling or just in the types of
absolutely.
experience they want to get next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, and that's part of the best part of those intentional pauses, right?
Right.
And it's a learning journey the whole time.
Yeah.
And And I think the other piece that you asked about earlier, you were saying like, what are some of the tangible questions that I might ask along the way? Besides, so what, and now what? Um, the way that co-op and experiential education has been kind of positioning the topic of reflection is around something called the purposeful work concept.
Okay.
And I think it's a really tangible way for students to think about themselves as a whole, as a person, and looking forward beyond this work term or this will experience. Um, and so the way that they've been like thinking about it, and I'm not the thought leader in this space, so that's why I'm saying they, um, but it talks about reflecting on your talents and skills,
Right.
right? And what you hope to accomplish. And it talks about the values and needs, what motivates you, and why would you want to choose a type of will experience. It talks about the impact that you want to make.
Right.
And so for yourself as an individual, what impact do I want to have this will experience, and how do I want to change? What do I want to do for the organization?
Right.
Maybe what do I want to do in society?
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, it talks about how do I want to engage?
Yeah.
Right. And what type of will experience is the right one for me? And I think those are really simple and easy ways to weave in a more holistic view of reflection too, beyond just the work term and the what, so what, and now what. It helps you to think about the learner as a whole.
Right.
And I think it's a really cool, like kind of future proofing ourselves thing for students, right? Because the
Absolutely.
world is changing so fast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What kind of tools do we have available for students to help them with the practice of reflection?
There's tools, and then I think there's like people to help guide you.
Right.
And I just gave you two, I guess, complex topics, right? You could think about, what, so what, now what, or you could think about this purposeful work concept, and it's kind of about meeting students where they are. So I think the first tool that we have in a co-op and experiential education is actually the different advisors and people that support our learners
Right.
along the way. Before, during, and after our learners' experiences, we have career advisors and student advisors guiding students through these concepts and helping them to pause along the way.
Right.
And explain to them that, you don't have to have this big, giant written reflection. Stop for a minute on your walk home as you're walking from the bus and say, how did I do at applying my project management skills today?
Yeah.
Right. And that's reflection. And those advisors help students to kind of build it into their normal day to day.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big thing. You also have, normal tools like workshops and different things to help guide people in this space, but it's about a way of being and about that intentional pause.
Absolutely.
So I think that's my first tool. And then we also have more tangible tools like assignments in courses that we build that kind of come out of my space that at the end of, say, a will experience or a work term,
right.
We kind of force them to do a bit of reflection.
Right. And that's in the professional development courses.
That's right. Yeah, that's correct. And I think that's a great opportunity. It helps students to see value in it. And sometimes they need a little push to start to think in this way. And then once they realize, oh, if I articulate my skills of like, I built this Excel spreadsheet, but here's the impact I make, and here's what I want to do forward, that actually really helps me in my next job. So helping to get them into that wheel of reflection, sometimes a little push of a professional development course.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like on the job, how can employers help students to reflect on the work experience?
I think this is such a fantastic opportunity because mentorship, I think, is the best space, and the student wants to learn
right
on the job. And so my initial reaction to that question is sit down and have a one-on-one with the student and ask them about that before experience thing that they talked about.
Right.
And say, like, what was the skill or talent that you were hoping to gain in your workplace here? Tell me about it.
Right.
Oh, you wanted to apply your discipline-specific knowledge in a communication way. Very cool. How do you think you're doing on it so far? Right. And see how they react. And then yourself as the mentor, provide them with a little bit of feedback.
Right.
Actually, I agree. Like, you're really on track, doing great in that communication piece, especially in your verbal communication. I think it's becoming really clear. People are understanding your words. And then you could provide a little bit of feedback on, but what might be helpful is maybe drawing something or using a whiteboard at the same time,
Right.
right? And that mentorship, that's a tangible form of reflection, and will feed forward so nicely for the student overall, and then into that, before experience, the during experience, where I just got that from the employer, and then after the experience, they can say, "Here's what my employer told me," which is pretty cool, and I think a value add on hopefully both ends.
As a supervisor, it almost gives you a nice track as well, because you can keep checking against that as the term progresses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if I was going to say, um, like, how many times, there's no answer for how many times you would want to be on track
Right.
in that space. It's about intentional pauses that happen often. So
Mm-hmm.
to your point, checking in, you know, every, few weeks or something like that, even to see, like, how's that going,
Absolutely.
right? And that's a great learning opportunity for the student, but also, to your point, kind of tracking performance and seeing how they're doing in that space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So beyond students, how can an employer use reflection to help his own staff, and even, better serve customers in their organization?
So I don't want to be overly simplistic, but I think it's the same style of piece of where, if you were saying helping a customer or helping your own staff member, um, taking someone for a walk for 5 minutes, and instead of talking about a project that
Mm-hmm.
you're working on, talk about the skills that underline the project.
Right.
Right? So, hi, Jody. You work for me now for a minute. And we go for a walk together, and I say, so what skills are you working on right now? And you'd say, oh, I'm working on, my translating discipline specific knowledge into a more generalist form. I was like, oh, fantastic. How are you applying that in your project right now? And then you
Right.
would tell me about that link, and then I provide feedback. Right? It's a very different conversation than
Mm-hmm.
saying, the project you're working right on, what's the tasks you're working on,
Right. Or what's the status?
or what's the status,
Yes.
right? So you still get the same status update, you still get
Mm-hmm.
those pieces, but it builds from, like, a continuous learning perspective,
Right.
and takes that individual from a space of surface learning, of, like, this is my work, this is my project, to more of, like, a deep, like, these are the skills I applied, which in general, like, improves productivity, and
Right.
and
And
pro-
probably interest in the job.
that's right,
Yeah.
exactly. So that would be my kind of, and it's the same for students, right?
Yes,
On a work
absolutely.
term, same for, it applies across, which I think is really cool.
Absolutely. And there's so many benefits to that,
Yeah.
because, as you said, it's improving productivity. It's making people feel more connected to their job and not just coming in and kind of almost turning their brain off and just doing their continuous tasks.
It ties into why they've called it purposeful work, right? And I think
Absolutely.
that's the really cool part, is, framing those conversations in that way really does change, um, how you think about your work and the
Absolutely.
impact you can make. So,
Absolutely. And so when we talk about reflection with students, how do we feel like this is setting them up to be ready for the future of work?
I think there's a couple ways. So on the micro level, right? I think you've alluded to it already, right? This reflection, helps maybe from one work term to the next,
Right.
right? Improving that next cover letter, applying for that next job with practical examples, and I think that's kind of like that first step, right? How does reflection help?
Mm-hmm.
Gets me to my next step, right?
Right.
And maybe choosing the next will opportunity for me in the right way, or the next volunteer opportunity, or whatever it happens to be. Um, I think more on a macro level, when you think about reflection in this way, um, and this kind of concept of purposeful work in the, your values and needs and your
Right.
talents and skills and the impact you want to make, and how you want to engage. When you think about reflection in that way, it helps to set us up for a much more, like, solid basis in a more volatile world,
Right.
right? So, instead of saying my career path is linear and therefore I will go from A to B to C, if you think about these kind of reflective prompts along the way, it's going to help you to meander and actually make meaning in your
Mhm.
work, in your jobs. And so, building this in for students early helps them to think differently about the way they position their careers.
Right.
And so that's kind of my more macro positioning. But you got to have those moments of intentional pause, because if you don't have them, then you're just blindly walking through
Yeah.
and hoping for the best. And so that's why I think it's such an important concept.
Well, I think it could really help students, especially junior students or when they first graduate and trying to think about that career, that maybe that one job isn't exactly in your field, but there's skills there that you need
Yeah,
that you can really build in that one job and then take that to the next step through that reflection.
that's right.
And I think that's so valuable for students because we do tend to think, our parents and grandparents tell us
Yep.
that they just build that career and you take step to step to step and it's very linear.
Mhm.
But in today's world, that's not how it works.
Yeah, it's just not where we're headed, right? And I think it's about making meaning then in your career path and showing how you
Absolutely.
can transfer those skills, right? From one spot to the other. And so if you can have an understanding of your skills and an understanding of what you value and what type of impact you want to make,
Hmm.
then you can figure out how you want to engage,
Absolutely.
right? And that engagement could look completely different
Yeah.
for the first 2 years of your even post-secondary career, and then into your second, and then as you move out of that and into the world of work. And that's why it's so nice and holistic when you think about um, just, yeah, stopping and thinking.
As an employer, if I'm thinking about the fact that students are going through a reflection process and thinking about skills, what can I do before I even meet the students? So, in a job posting, to help attract the students that have that same intentionality that I do.
Mm. So I think because students are reflecting before the experience, right? And that's something we're building into the wheel of the way that they're thinking. They're thinking about the talents and skills that they want to hone in on and apply.
Right.
And they're coming in with that lens. And so then they're looking at job postings or will experiences with that lens.
Hmm.
So how can you draw out in your job postings, these are the skills that we hope that you'll gain and get
Right.
to apply in this work. So even if, say, you know, you're coming from the lens of maybe more something that students would consider in the humanities field,
Hmm.
but you're looking for data science and AI, like put those skills in, right? And
Right.
that communication piece, because that's going to translate into students being like, oh, I could apply that skill here. That's really interesting. Students, that can help them to see a bigger net,
Right.
and the transferability of their skills beyond their direct discipline. And I think there's great value in that. So if they're thinking about those skills and you're actually, I'm going to call it marketing the skills,
Right.
right? It's a much easier connection point
Okay.
from the employer to the student.
And then once I have the student in the work experience and we're having those, probably that, first conversation where you try to find out what they want to learn, but there's also skills and projects that I want them to accomplish.
Mhm.
How do you help frame that conversation so that there is that balance with these two different intentions coming to the table?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So if this is my initial conversation, I think you start by meeting them where they're at and asking them, what are the skills that you're hoping to gain
Right.
from this will experience? What attracted you to the job at this space? We're already in the job, so that's a great
Exactly.
start, right?
Yeah.
And then you're saying that's fantastic. Here's the skills that we're really looking for you to apply, right? In this work term or this will experience. And here's the projects. Then you start connecting,
Okay.
right? And here's the projects that I'd like to get you started on. And that starts to make meaning for the student beyond, oh, you're asking me to make an Excel spreadsheet,
Exactly.
right? And I think those connections then automatically start to engage your students in a way that without that connection, they may not make meaning right off the bat.
Right.
And so it's like kind of a value added for you because I think you get better work productivity and students start to understand what you're trying to do. But it's a value added for them because they're like, oh, and I'm here and I'm already starting to apply the skills that I was hoping to. Um, the task might just look different than what they had envisioned the task to be.
Right.
So it's about helping them to translate that from, their grandeur changing maybe the narrative of the whole way the company works to, a process
Right.
that we're hoping for you to accomplish.
Exactly.
So
Well, and it makes it sound a lot more interesting
that's right.
to the student,
That's right.
and see how it relates. And I think that's the biggest part of reflection is making those connections.
Yeah, that's right. It's making that connection. And then if we did that, and then you could do that as you exit as
Right.
well, right? And checking in on, from the employer lens, checking in on, how did we do at accomplishing those skills together, right? What value did I provide as a supervisor in the employer lens, and how did the projects fit your needs, right? Which then,
Right.
if you're, going back into another recruiting term, you can then update your job descriptions and those things again to say like, yeah, we feel confident in these are the skills we're looking for.
Absolutely.
So I think there's value add on both sides when you come from this lens of kind of this purposeful work, skills based. It just changes the narrative.
Absolutely.
Okay.
With work integrated learning, we see both informal and formal processes for reflection. Is one better than the other, or do we need both?
So I run a lot of courses, so there's some bias here in that I absolutely love kind of that more formal reflection opportunities, but I'm going to answer with you need both.
Right.
And I think they complement each other.
Okay.
Right. And if you think about formal types of reflection, say built into a PD course,
Mm-hmm.
um, or, a work term report or different things that you have to do, right? Those are almost opportunities where we kind of guide you to flex those reflection muscles,
Right.
right? And then you can take from those kind of guided formal work integrated learning reflections where you're like, okay, this is exactly what I did in my classroom, and this how I applied it in my work term, and this is how I articulated it so that I can use it for my next job interview. Like we've kind of given you that formal structure,
Exactly.
right? But the best part of it, and if you're doing reflection really well in those intentional pauses, you take from that formal thing what you love,
Right.
and then you use it informally, intentionally on your own to check in the end, at the end of a work day or a
Mm-hmm.
will experience day and say, okay, how did that go? What tools did I apply? Did I like it? Right? Like they complement each other.
Right.
And the formal can help teach you to do informal well and pick and choose the pieces that you love.
Right.
And if you're still struggling, that's where you get the Center for Career Development and other formal kind of or like supports to help you to do that
Right.
informal really well, because it is hard.
Yes.
It's a practice. It's a learned practice. And then once you've got it, it makes great sense. And it might wake you up at night as you start to reflect on your day.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in to this conversation with the director of the Center for Work Integrated Learning, Dr. Andrea Prier. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or you can watch the whole conversation on YouTube. You can find links to our social media platforms in the show notes so you can stay up to date with what's happening in cooperative and experiential education. Join us again for the next episode of Work, Learn, Repeat.